Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gabester here. This is the tank guide for heroic Siegecrafter Blackfuse, and this video will assist tank players with all the basics that you'll need to know to get through this fight on heroic difficulty. So to begin, let's briefly talk about the new mechanic that you'll deal with on heroic, which is Overcharged weapons. So this ability is used basically once per assembly phase. So the 3 assembly weapons are spawned on the assembly line in the top left there of the room. And one of these is destroyed by some DPS normally. And the other 2 weapons will then spawn on the other side of the room just like normal difficulty and start engaging your raid. Every time those 2 weapons appear on the other side, one of them will be overcharged by the boss on heroic. And Overcharge has a few basic rules to determine how the boss chooses the overcharged target. So you can see in the top there the basic priority rules. Each weapon has a higher priority than the last. So the highest priority is magnet, then mines, missile, and finally laser. And Overcharge is selected based on the weapon that has the fewest total overcharges thus far that is highest in that priority list. So with this information, your raid can basically figure out which weapon will overcharge next. That said, your raid group will likely have a planned order for how to handle the assembly line weapons, and this will determine the overcharge order out in the main room as well, which as a tank you'll have to deal with. So let's talk briefly about the actual overcharge mechanics and what they do to affect the fight. Now, in no particular order, we'll talk about Shockwave Missile first. When this gets overcharged, it will create a overcharged Shockwave Missile instead of a regular one. Now you can see the missile kind of in the back there near my character, and these overcharged versions are basically targetable and killable. Now, while they're active, before you kill them, they'll spawn the waves just like the normal missiles. However, as soon as you kill that particular missile, it ceases to spawn waves from that point forward. And if you don't kill it fast enough, it will continue to spawn new waves after it reaches the end of its cycle. So the overcharged Shockwave Missile just needs to be killed, and otherwise the missile waves need to be dodged just like normal. Now, the second overcharge is Laser Turret. When this becomes overcharged, it will create 3 almost full concentric circles in specific areas around the room. So you can see these waves of laser fire spawning there around the room, and I'm sort of between 2 of the circles in a safe spot. So for the most part, you'll want to be in position in a safe location, depending on what you're doing at the time as a tank, before these waves spawn, knowing that they're going to pop up when they appear and where you can safely stand to do your normal duties. So other than that, you can also run between the gaps that exist in each of these rings. You can see the top-down diagram here that shows you kind of roughly where those gaps appear, and these always are in the same spot because the overcharged lasers are always in the same location every time they appear. So with this diagram, you can get an idea for your general positioning, what you're doing at the time, where you might want to stand so that you can be between the lasers or you can safely move between concentric circles if needed. The third overcharge is for Electromagnet. So if you watch here, you can see that the saw blades around the room are being pushed and pulled by the magnet. So the overcharged magnet, instead of just pulling everything in one time and getting rid of it, it causes this back and forth push and pull sequence a few times while it's active. So the basic idea here is that since you won't be able to use the saw blades while this magnet is going on as a tank, you also have to watch for the saw blades that are flying back and forth and dodge them appropriately. But generally speaking, they're not that dangerous if you get hit by one as a tank, since they don't do that much damage and they're physical. So you do want to dodge the saw blades whenever possible, but overall it's not that big a deal. And then finally, we have the overcharged mines. So here you can see a set of overcharged mines spawning from the back of the room and running towards the raid as they normally do. So the overcharged mines are basically large versions of the mines. You can see one on the right there. When an overcharged mine is killed, it spawns 2 of the normal crawler mines in its place, and these will proceed to fixate on random players as well. As a tank, you're an invalid target for mines in terms of fixate, So the best thing you can do when your raid is dealing with mines is, as a tank, is to help out with DPS. You can get in melee range of them and attack them and do quite a bit of significant damage. So again, depending on your overall strategy and positions, if you're available to move into position to help with mines, that will be really useful for your raid. Now with the new mechanic for Heroic out of the way, we'll talk about the most important aspect of this fight for tanking, which is Shredder management. So just like in normal difficulty, the Shredders will spawn on the right side of the room away from the assembly line, and these need to be picked up by the one of the tanks, the current off tank that's not on the boss, basically. There are a few ways, however, to handle the Shredders, so I'll talk about each of those different methods in turn and the pros and cons of each. So you can sort of decide between you and your tank partner or the raid as a whole, which will work best for you. So the first method, which is what we use here that you see in the footage, is basically a pretty standard pattern. This is almost exactly what you would do for normal difficulty, where you just swap every time a new shredder pops out. Now, the amount of damage, of course, you do to the shredder is based on the number of stacks of electrostatic charge you get from the boss. And so some tanks with higher burst DPS that can attack the shredder after it drops from its leap attack will need fewer stacks than those with lower damage. So in our specific raid, what we have is a monk tank and a paladin tank, and our monk found that he was able to handle the shredders with 3 stacks of the debuff or electrostatic, which is a standard number. That's a very low number. You don't even really need cooldowns getting up to 3 stacks of the debuff. Our paladin preferred 4 stacks of it. He found that extra 4th stack really helped his DPS, and he was able to drop his shredder appropriately. So, for our raid, we just did this cycle of 3 stacks on the monk, then 4 stacks on the paladin, then 3 on the monk, and 4, and back and forth. And that worked great. And these days, since the health of the shredders has been reduced slightly since a recent patch, this will be fairly easy for your tanks, assuming you're working on progression on this fight. So I would highly recommend that method of a 3 or 4 stack maximum, and just handling these shredders kind of as you normally would in normal difficulty, standing them in saw blades and or the laser fire, whichever is more convenient or possible, and then using your burst DPS cooldowns after the shredders drop down from their leap attack. Another possibility, however, is if you need a higher stack count to do more DPS to the shredders and sort of make it easier for your raid to survive as a whole, you can do that as well. This method sort of revolves around swapping more frequently than the shredders spawn, so that the first tank that gets stacks on the boss, they go up to 3, they tank the other ad, or the shredder first ad like normal, and then they kill it fast enough that they can refresh their electrostatic stack before their stack drops after killing the ad. In the worst case scenario, if you can't kill your shredder before your stack's about to drop, you can taunt the boss while still tanking the shredder just before he casts electrostatic. And this will refresh your stack, the boss will run toward you and cast that restack, and then the other tank just grabs him back. So with this sort of method, common strategies are to go up to 3 on the first tank, 2 on the second, then up to 5 on the first tank again, and then up to 5 on the second tank, and then reset the first tank basically after that. So you can kind of work out these specific details, but we found that the requirement, I guess I would say, for the tank timing and such, when you go up to these high stack counts, didn't outweigh the relative difficulty of killing the shredder with a lower stack count. So we found it was still easy enough to kill the shredder with a decent stack count, using the environmental effects as appropriate, than rather trying to get tanks to go up to high stacks. So you can experiment between the two methods, but this is what I would recommend. It's much easier. Another consideration for handling the shredder, and of course the boss, is general positioning. This will depend a fair bit on your raid's overall strategy, and therefore the positioning of the boss and the raid as a whole. So there are 2 basic setups to this. I won't go into the strategies themselves. You can check out the full raid guide that has detailed information about those if you want. But the basic idea is that one strategy, which is the one you see in our video, keeps the boss on the left near the assembly line. And therefore the shredder that spawns comes from the opposite side of the room. The other strategy reverses it sort of, so that the boss is kept on the right where the shredder appears, and thus the shredder needs to be moved away from the boss after it spawns. So if you're doing the left-hand strategy like we are here, obviously the off-tank that picks up the shredder can just intercept it as it's running toward the raid and just hold it out kind of in the center in the room. So you can see the shredder kept in the center there, during lasers, so that that tank can stand him in the laser fire if needed, or any saw blades that exist. And as long as one of the healers is within range of that tank, it's fairly simple. Another option, if you want, if you're doing the other strategy where your raid is on the right near the shredder spawn, especially if you don't have very much melee DPS, you can actually tank the shredder on top of Blackfuse, so that both tanks, who both will have electrostatic charges at some point, can attack the shredder simultaneously. And then all you need to do is run out as appropriate when the shredder leaps in the air. But overall, the damage on the shredder itself, if both tanks are attacking it near the boss, will be very high. But as I said, this method is only really possible if you don't have melee DPS, because otherwise they'll need to run out when the shredder leaps into the air, which is kind of a pain. So those are the considerations for positioning, and again, it depends mostly on your raid's overall strategy and positioning as well. The second big consideration is the damage from electrostatic charge. Since on Heroic this is quite severe. So on the top left there you can see a basic chart that shows the stack count, or the application number on you, and then the baseline damage of that electrostatic charge hit. Now it's important, of course, to note that as a tank you'll have reduced damage innately, so you won't take the full amount. But you can consider 10 or 20% less off of those numbers and kind of get an idea for the hit. So generally speaking, our tanks did not really need a cooldown for the first 3 hits, as long as they were full health, or even had a minor cooldown if they have a cheap one like our monk did. They can take the first 3 hits of electrostatic charge without a cooldown pretty easily. And that's pretty standard stuff. However, 4 and beyond, you're definitely going to need a cooldown. And of course, the cooldown you require will go up pretty quickly as you get into the higher damage levels. So 1.5 million baseline at 4 is not that severe. You may need a 30 or 40% cooldown. But for the later ones, you're going to need quite a strong one, 50% or higher. So obviously, if you're only going to 3 or 4 stacks max, this should be pretty easy to manage. But you can just use this basic data to plan out for your class which cooldowns you can use and how frequently you can use them, depending on how many stacks you need to go to. So aside from handling the boss electrostatic charge count, and of course the shredder management and killing that off appropriately, the only other thing to consider really is how you handle overcharge weapon mechanics. Some of these are far more important to consider as a tank than others, so we'll just talk about some of those briefly. The overcharged missile, for example, doesn't really matter as a tank. If you are near enough to a missile spawn location that you can move into range and kill it, even while you're holding your other target, which is usually Siegecrafter at the time because he's on the outside edge, then feel free to do so. Extra DPS doesn't hurt. As long as it doesn't screw up your overall raid positioning to move the boss at the time, that's fine, and you can just move him back in position. But otherwise, the overcharged missile doesn't really matter because its waves do the same damage as the normal version, so you just need to dodge the waves as you normally would. For the overcharged magnet, the saw blades, as I mentioned, are not that important unless you're on the right side of the room, kind of near where the magnet sucks everything in. Then you need to be careful that you're not so near the magnet position that all the saw blades will pass through you simultaneously, because that'll probably kill you. But otherwise, a single saw blade hitting you occasionally is not a big deal, and most of the time you can avoid them completely. The magnet itself does some damage while it's pulsing, but it's very minor, and as a tank it won't even matter. The overcharged crawler mines, as I mentioned before, can be killed by tanks. They will not target or fixate on you, so this is a great opportunity to do some extra DPS as a tank and help with the mines. It's particularly important if you are tanking something that doesn't really require being in a specific position, or if you're not even tanking something at a time, which of course can happen if you killed off your shredder but you don't need the boss yet. And then finally is the overcharged laser. As I also mentioned there, using this is mostly a matter of knowing where they're going to spawn around the room, when they're going to appear, and standing in position with the shredder or the boss, depending what you're holding, at the appropriate location. So for example, holding Blackfuse, you can see here we keep him kind of near the edge so that the outermost ring of the laser fire, when it appears, will be kind of in the center of the boss, so that as a tank you can be on either side of that laser ring and be safe while you're holding the boss. For the shredder, of course, you can do the same basic thing, but keeping the shredder in the laser will help you a lot with damage. So that really covers everything. It's a pretty simple fight for tanking, to be quite honest about it. It really just comes down to your appropriate swaps for the electrostatic charge stack and picking up the shredder, and then figuring out your ultimate burst DPS cooldowns to get the shredder down as quickly as possible, because that's the most important factor in this fight when it comes to tanking. So it's tough to offer specific suggestions for every tank, but the best thing you can do to help out your raid is just go look up forums or class forums for your class and find information about this fight on Heroic, and there'll be plenty of tips for your particular class on what you can do to up your burst damage on the shredder. And once you've got that down, everything else falls into place pretty quickly. So, as always, good luck, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, please subscribe.